So this video is going to show you how to either upgrade your already RGH'd Xbox 360 Slim or freshly install RGH3 onto your Xbox 360 Slim. Now, to find out what type of Xbox 360 Slim you have, just look at the power supply on the back of your Xbox and cross-reference it with this picture. Now, if you have a Trinity, I'm going to be doing a Trinity in this video. If you have a Corona, it'll work as well, it's just a different soldering point, but I've included pictures. Now, if you have an Xbox 360e, anything after 2014 probably won't work. Now, I'll detail everything in the video description, but what you're going to need for this video is a screwdriver set with Torx 8 and Torx 10 bit, and a few flathead screwdrivers, some thermal paste for the CPU to be reapplied, a Raspberry Pico and a USB stick, some 28 gauge or 30 gauge wire, a pack of 3 to 10K resistors. Now you're only going to need one, but buying a pack is cheaper, and some wire snips, and along with a soldering iron that can go up to 300 degrees. Now, whether you have a fresh Xbox 360 or one that's already RGH'd, you're going to want to boot it up and just see where it's at. Now, I actually discovered that this one was RGH'd after I bought it on Kijiji for 15 bucks, and when I booted it up, I noticed that the avatars were showing gray, which generally means that the system update hasn't been fully done. So that gave me a first hint that it was RGH'd. So then I went over to the game section and I noticed that there was already a whole bunch of games on there, and I did find it funny how long it took to boot. So one further step is if you select demos in the game section, you'll see EXE menu. Now that's a dead giveaway that the thing's already been RGH'd. Now another good way is to boot it up with the disk drive open. This should boot into Zell, which is an alternative boot screen for RGH'd Xboxes. Now, since mine is already RGH'd, I'm going to let this thing boot up, and you'll notice, and you're going to need this later on, is that it'll show you your CPU key. Now that we've checked out that Xbox is running, we're going to jump right into disassembly. Now, I find the Xbox 360 is one of the hardest consoles to disassemble, so we're going to start it off with just using a flathead screwdriver and pulling off these covers on the front and bottom of the Xbox. Then we're going to be greeted with these cover plates. Now, the only way to get these cover plates is pretty much to pry them off, so I'm going to use a slightly bigger flathead screwdriver and just pry it gently all around the little clips here. Now it gives you little places to put the flathead in, which is nice. Now if it's a fresh Xbox 360, prying it off is going to be a little difficult and you're going to have to use a little bit of force. If it's already been taken apart, it's going to be slightly easier. Now if you're gentle, it shouldn't take you too long. And once we get that, we're going to be faced with these chrome plates. Now they're not always chrome, sometimes they're just matte black or black. But either way, all the clips are in the same place. Now, the ones in the back here are a little bit harder to get to, so I'm going to switch to a smaller screwdriver on the other side. Well, eventually. Now, be very careful, because if these clips break, they're not going to sit properly when you try to reassemble it back. Now, I didn't notice my camera stand was a little bit loose, but we'll get this reassembled. But once I get the face clips off, I noticed that the Wi-Fi chip is missing in here, which is probably from the last owner not wanting to connect to Xbox Live to get his Xbox banned. So these 4 clips are pretty tricky. These 2 are fairly simple, so you want to declip them and pull the case apart. When you flip to the other side, you could access the first clip fairly easy, but the 4th clip is tucked way behind, and I've noticed if you press pretty hard on that area right there, it'll pop the case apart. Then with a little bit of work, that top part should slide off fairly easily. Now I'm greeted to a whole bunch of missing screws, which is not a big deal, but when you could pretty much take every single screw off here. Now you're going to want to start with a 10 Torx bit and just work your way around the console, and the longer screws are for the case and the shorter screws are for the motherboard. So we're going to take all these screws off here, make sure you get every single one, and then we could flip the Xbox over and we could take off the other part of the case. Now, so that this thing doesn't dangle, I'm going to just take apart the front cover. And there's usually 2 screws that are holding the faceplate here, but I only have 1. Now, that's a Torx 8-bit, I believe, and same with these 4 screws that hold the CPU heatsink. So use Torx 8 to dismantle that, and then we're going to take out the DVD drive, and you can see there's the glitch chip. So this thing, yes, was definitely RGH'd previously. So we'll take a quick peek here. Everything looks pretty clean. There's the glitch chip. So I'm going to take apart the fan, and the next thing we're going to work on is the CPU. Now this X clamp is usually pretty tricky, but all what you got to do, if it's fresh, it shouldn't give you too much grief. You just stick your screwdriver in between the holder and the X clamp and pry it in the direction of the other side, and now usually it'll just pop out. This one, it seems to be bent a little bit, so it's causing me a little bit of grief, but I'm just going to go with a slightly bigger shank for my screwdriver, and that should do it. There we go. So now that we've got that all disassembled, we'll take a quick peek here. I'm going to turn on my soldering iron and set it to 300 degrees. Now, you don't have to have a fancy setup like this one here. Just a normal soldering iron will work with a chisel tip, I would recommend. Now, this guy did a not too bad job soldering. It's a little messy, but we're going to apply some flux to the points that we want to desolder. And we're just going to slowly or slightly touch the areas. And if you're familiar with soldering, then this is not going to be hard at all. If you're new to soldering, I would just get used to the soldering iron with a, I don't know, a scrap PCB board. Take something apart and test it out, because the points are fairly small. Now, each glitch chip is probably going to be installed a little bit differently, so just take apart all the parts that are soldered onto the board and then work on prying off the glitch chip wherever it's installed. Now, if your Xbox wasn't RGH'd previously, you could skip all this. Now all I'm doing here is just cleaning up the soldering areas that were touched earlier. So I just applying a little bit of flux and some solder wick and sucking up any of the extra solder that's there and cleaning it up with some isopropanol and a toothbrush. Now that everything's looking a little bit clean, I'm going to re-tin the areas, which is just reapplying heat. And then we're going to do the same thing to the back of the board. The most confusing part about RGHing an Xbox is what motherboard you have and where you need to solder the points to. So I've included these 2 pictures as reference in the download pack to make things easier. One is of the Trinity model and one is of the Corona model. Now it's pretty much the same thing. There's 4 points to solder, and one of the points on both boards in the same location needs to be scratched on the back of the PCB, but more on that later. First, we're going to install a resistor on a strand of 28 or 30 gauge wire. Now take about a foot of wire and just cut it right in half, and then we're going to install our resistor in between. So all you got to do is take your wire and wrap it around as close to the end of the terminal and solder it with a little bit of flux, and then snip the extra terminal off. And for extra protection, add a little bit of heat shrink onto it so that it doesn't short out if anything moves later on. So as you can see here, I've got about a foot of wire, and I'm going to place it on the back of the board where I'm going to install it, and I'm going to gauge how much wire I'm going to need and snip it accordingly. Now once you've got all that complete, we're going to get the back of the board ready to solder the points on. And this is where the tricky part comes. On both Trinity or Corona boards, the spot is in the same spot. So you're going to take a corner of your screwdriver and lightly scratch the back of the board and use the picture I've included as reference. Now it doesn't take too much, so just slightly scratch it and wipe off the PCB dust that's left over. This exposes the pad so that we could solder our wire to the point. So this is the trickiest part of the RGH install, and we just got that out of the way. Now we're going to install the other end of this wire. Again, just use my picture as reference, and we'll tape the resistor so it doesn't move around. And we're going to do the same thing with this other wire. So we're going to snip it, apply some flux, and we're going to solder this one pad right here, and then we're going to solder the other pad, which this is a little tricky, so be careful, don't hit any other components in the way. Now you can be pretty liberal with the flux, just make sure you clean it up afterwards. And again, these points are fairly small, so if you haven't soldered in a while or new to soldering, just practice with the PCB board before you go right into your 360. Now we're going to clean up the extra flux here with a little bit of isopropanol. Now flux isn't conductive, so it won't short anything out, but it's still nice to have a nice clean board. And I just like to tape down these wires so they don't get pulled or moved later on, because if you pull the pads, then it's a nightmare. But if you're gentle, you should be lucky. And then we're going to jump back to installing the heatsink back on. Now you can see on the back of the heatsink it's got a little channel for that row of capacitors there. So that's a guide for how you put it back on. And then there's so many different ways on how to install CPU thermal paste, but pretty much all you need to do is get a thin layer across the whole CPU pad, and I like to squirt a little bit extra on the heatsink itself, so when it does apply the pressure, it doesn't squeeze everything out from underneath. So we're going to get that lined up, and now when you apply the X clamp, be careful you don't knock off any of the components when you're trying to put it on. Clip on one side, clip on the other side, and there you go. Now we're going to go to installing our Raspberry Pico. Now I've included two pictures, one for the Trinity and one for the Corona. The Corona is a little bit more tricky, and I might just do a whole other video on Corona motherboards. But if you're following along and you have a Corona motherboard, the basically things you need to know is that you got to check the resistors that are highlighted in the picture and make sure they're all there. And if they're not, just bridge those points, meaning you got to solder the two pads together with a strand of wire. And there's two different methods to solder your Raspberry Pico to the motherboard. So with these pictures as reference, we're going to jump right into the soldering. We're going to apply some flux to the areas that we're going to solder to. And I've already cut about 7 wires that are all the same length. And I've prepped the tips of the wires to have just about a couple millimeters showing of bare wire. And all I do is touch the very tip of it with my soldering iron to the area. And with the flux right there, it solders really nicely and pretty clean as well. So depending on your model that you're soldering, it'll depend on which wires you need to solder to, but the pictures will be a good reference. Now I've soldered all these to the point. The ground wire is usually always a little tricky. So we're going to clean up all this extra flux here and make it look nice and pretty again. And now we're going to solder it to our Raspberry Pico board. So I've got this nice little holder, but you don't have to, but it definitely makes life a lot easier. And now is this Trinity motherboard. I'm going to flux all the pads that I'm going to be soldering to. And same thing, you want to have very short bare wire at the end, maybe a millimeter or two. and just work down the side and tap the areas with your chisel tip. You can see here my holder even supplies me with my solder, and I've also got solder wick, which is just, as I used earlier, a whole bunch of copper wire in a strand. So now that we've got our teensy all soldered up here, we've got to program it. So we're going to clean everything up and jump to the computer. So on the computer, first things first is we're going to format a USB stick to FAT32. So just plug that in there and right click on your file explorer and select format, and just make sure it's selected to FAT32. If you can't see FAT32, your drive is too big, and I've included a tool in the download pack we're going to extract right next to format larger drives. So as I said, we're going to extract this file, which I've included a link in the video description, and we'll just delete the archive, save space I guess. But we're going to open up this folder and we're going to go to the third folder, HDD and dash, and then we're going to open up USB FAT32 and copy everything over to our freshly formatted USB stick. So you're going to notice some other files and folders pop up on the screen. Disregard that, I've just edited this video with another video I'm making. Now that we have our USB set up, we're going to want to program our Pico. So we're going to hold down the load button and plug it into our computer. You're going to see a folder pop up, which is our Raspberry Pico. Then in the second folder of the Case 360 pack called RGH, there's a file called Pico Flasher. We'll drag that over to the file explorer that popped up for our Raspberry Pico. And then we're going to jump over to our Xbox 360. So we're going to semi-reassemble our Xbox 360 so that we could power on Zell to get our CD key. So we're going to do this by plugging in our faceplate, which will power on and off the Xbox, and the eject button. And we're going to use the hard drive caddy just as a support for our disk drive. Now we want our disk drive to be fully assembled so that we have the power and the SATA cable plugged in. Then if you have an Ethernet cable, plug it into the back of the Xbox and your computer. Now I never get this to work to get my CD key, and some people need an AV cable to get their display to work. Now back at our computer, we're going to open up the 360 pack and open up the RGH folder, and inside that you'll see JRunner. We're going to open it up and run it as administrator. Now with your Pico Flasher plugged in your computer and standby power on your Xbox 360, that is, your Xbox 360 just has the power plugged in but not turned on, you can read the NAND. So click the read NAND button on the JRunner and it'll proceed to dump the NAND twice and compare the two to see if they're the same. Now if they aren't the same, do not proceed and double check all your soldering. These need to be the same before you do anything else. Now if they're the same, you can click glitch 2M or glitch 2 and make sure you have the box clicked reset glitch 3 on the side, and then you're going to create a Zell image. Now once the Zell image is created, you're going to want to write the Zell image. Now this will actually write some information to your NAND. Once that's complete, we want to boot up into Zell, which you do that by powering on the Xbox by pressing the eject button. Now with any luck, you'll see Zell loaded up, and if it isn't, make sure that you're using an AV cable. Now wait a few seconds and you should see your CPU key. Now write that down and jump back to your computer. Now for this next step, you want to make sure your Xbox is turned off and has standby power, meaning it just has the power cable plugged in. We're going to open up JRunner and we're going to run it as administrator. We're going to reload the NANDs that we just dumped from our Xbox 360. So we're going to load NAND 1 and NAND 2, just like I did here. I'm going to compare them just to make sure that they're the same. We're going to type in our CPU key. I'm going to plug in my Pico flasher, and then I'm going to click this question mark to see if it's connected. Now I'm going to be exploring around here a little bit, but you want to have RGH2 and RGH3 clicked. And for the patches, I wouldn't choose anything, but you can have these selected here to either extend your hard drive to be over 2 terabytes. Now I wouldn't do that for your first go at it. Now once you have your settings clicked, now you can see I forgot to click glitch 2, but I want to have glitch 2 selected, and I want to create XE build. Now this will take a few seconds. Once that's complete, we're going to write the NAND. Now again, you don't want to have Zell loaded on the screen. You want your Xbox to be fully powered off, but have the power cable plugged in. Now this will take a few minutes, and cross your fingers, the write is successful. So that's it for that. I'm going to jump back to the 360 and make sure it does power on. And so far so good. So we're going to jump back to our 360 and start to reassemble it. Now I like to leave the flasher cables soldered on and just disconnect the flasher. So I'm just going to snip that off and get everything organized and start putting it back together. So we're going to want to put our motherboard back into its shell, which is fairly simple. You just want to make sure that everything is seated down nice and flat. Double check the USB ports and the AV ports, and it's all lined up properly. Once that's done, I'm going to start off with the smaller Torx 8 screws, which is for the CPU, and I'm going to tighten those up there, and that's at least going to get our Xbox aligned, or the motherboard aligned in the shell. Then we're going to go around the back of the case and try to get some of the motherboard screws in there. Now you could throw the hard drive caddy in, and then you could screw those ones in as well. Now again, my 360 didn't have all its screws on because this is an upgrade, but you probably have all your screws, so just make sure that you get the screws on the side and the screws on the bottom. So I'm going to feed the flasher wires through the side, and then I'm going to reassemble the disk drive. Now just make sure that all the cables are plugged in, the fan cables, all that jazz. Now there's also a couple screws for the on and off faceplate. Now it's fairly easy going to reassemble this thing. It's a lot harder to disassemble it. Now once you have the bottom of the external shell plugged in, you can start doing the longer screws, which is for the shell. Once that's done, I'm going to put the top shell back in, clip everything together. And then for me it's the chrome pieces, but yours might be matte black. And then you put in the little holder, and then the faceplate. Now it's a little bit tricky. You're going to want to use a screwdriver and make sure everything is nice and seated, nice and flat, but everything generally clips in nice and easy. So we're going to do the exact same for the opposite side. Now again, you don't have to have your flasher wires, but I like to have mine there. Now if you ever want to reflash your 360, what you have to do is open up JRunner, and what you can do is load your original NAND, which after you put your CD key or your CPU key, it'll put it into a folder for you. Now you can change whatever settings you wanted to change. You could create XE build, and you can see it'll load an update for you, and all you need to do is copy that file over to a USB stick. Now if you put it to the root of any USB stick, even if it's got other files on there, now all you got to do is plug that into your 360 with Zell loaded. Again, all you got to do is power on your 360 with a with the eject button, and it'll automatically scan the USB drive and it'll reflash your Xbox. Now sometimes your Xbox won't boot, or you'll get a red ring after RGH. Now you don't have to have a TNC or a Pico flasher plugged in to reflash, which is handy. Now that we've got our Xbox booted up, we can see our avatars are originally not set up properly. So that's an easy fix. What you want to do is either plug in your hard drive if you have one, or we're going to plug in the USB stick that we got ready earlier, and you can see that there's an update on there. And so this will finish the update that we just did to the NAND, and as you can see here, all our avatars are fully installed. So we're going to sign in and take a quick peek. Now I'm going to get more into setting up a hard drive and games and all that, but here you go. This is how you could either RGH3 your Xbox 360 or upgrade in RGH2, whatever you want. Hopefully this helped, and like and subscribe for more videos.